First poem I'm going to read you several poems. They'll be from different books, from different periods in my life, some of them in different styles. I'm maybe a little unusual in that I don't turn my back on or disdain my early work for the most part. I like it just as much as I ever did. And I do disdain some of my recent work just as much as I ever disdained my older work. You learn what you learn, you write out of where you are when you're there. And when you do that job as well as you can, there's no particular reason to be embarrassed about it or proud about it later. So being young is no disadvantage for a writer at all. Most respected the teacher I had in college when I was a freshman, when he stood up and said, "You're all of you 18. We weren't, of course, but he said, "You're all of you 18 and you've all had the experiences required to write a major novel." He was lying, but we loved him for it, and we understood the gist of what he was trying to get at. First poem is called 7 for a Magician, 7 short parts. Out of his black hat he draws rabbit after rabbit, and out of the clear air breath after breath. It takes him years to learn perfectly the poise with which to reach into his own sleeve. Withdrawing the blaze of silk, it takes a generation of mulberry leaves and worms to spin, and the fingers of strangers to weave. For the magician about to astound his audience, for the lady about to betray her lover, for the matador into whose unborn wounds first the horns and scarlet scarf, then the faithful worm must pass. Applause. He bows. Applause. She cries out to the dark. Applause. His eyes widen as the horn sinks in and in. Who brushes the magician's favorite hat? The rabbit and the dove, while he tends to the hutch and scattered nest. His best makeup is in our minds, the hunger of old locks, rusted and lost, to be opened. Even skepticism is a prayer to him, for whom fire obeys the moon, for whom water burns. Imagine the key of ice designed to enter stone, the lock made of mercury, which is its own pure key, and look into the clarified eyes of just this one who performs dreams, who never sleeps. He brushes his teeth, blows his nose, eats with his mouth, has but one suit of clothes. He is very much like us, it would seem to us. After each performance, he disappears. Outside, the stars brighten. Inside, the lights go on. On the other side of the earth, it is morning, where he shares breakfast with a chimpanzee who asks if it all went well. They laugh as they eat. The last achievement of an ultimate magician is the proper care and treatment of all beings, filling the vast emptiness of that hat with which he lives. Before I had a name, the first voices to reach my ears, still blood-wet, crumpled, half clogged in birth grease as my head rocked in the harbor of thighs, eyes slits in the shock of first light, arms pinned flipper-like, writhing among slick walls, too constricted for even the first scald of air. The first voices I heard after knowing only the weather of blood thrum, the seasons of breathing, the rush of core fluids gurgling like cave water over stones, were the voices debating my decapitation and dismemberment. For though I was a 10-month baby, I was slow in coming. Huge blue galleon stalled between the shifting stones, pelvic bones of my mother. I was in trouble before I had a name, receiving instruction in how no trouble is ever one's own, always is shared by another. My mother lay helplessly, glowing with sweat and exhaustion, the great moon belly contracting and squeezing for life, hers, mine, as wise men conversed by a table set with the tools of our undoing. So these were the voices, desperately hushed, deliberate, and this my first brush with air, breathtaking, benumbing, glove-pale hands outstretched, gaudy with the blood of my birth. Masked faces glared, remote eyes hardening against me among the low yips and moans of my mother, as I, strangling, I, burning blue, was trying to suck the great emptiness, birth whale beached in the heavy coat of being, caving in these lungs that wanted to open expansive in the light of this other world, this sphere before knowing, where everything was luminous in robes of loose mist, even the scalpels decisively angled in hands so close. When the great thrust came that shoved me clear, and I fell, delivered into their hands at last. Most of you know the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus, the original, not the original, but one of the great singers, poets ultimately, and Eurydice, whom he loved. And she was taken into the underworld. She died. Because Orpheus was so beloved of the gods, he was allowed to go down and bargain with the god of darkness. He did, and the bargain, he was told, by the way, when he went down, the one thing you can't do is eat anything while you're down there. No free lunches, not even if you pay for them yourself. Nothing to be eaten, very important. He struck a bargain, and the bargain was pretty simple, and his part of it involved taking her now back to the land of light, land of the living, with one proviso: he couldn't look back at her. He couldn't look back at her until they reached the surface, or he would lose her forever. You all understand, of course, from the fairy tales you've heard all of your life, that, of course, is the one thing that he did, of course, to look back at her before he got to the top. Psychologically, you think about it, he is dealing with crooks, the ultimate organized crime gang down there, death. Why would he trust them? Why would he not think, for instance, they're just getting him to go back up to the top and she is not behind him at all? They're just getting him out of their hair with a silly little joke on him. For her part, she hasn't been told the deal. She's going up behind a guy. She's already been in Hades. She's already been dead for a bit. He didn't rescue her before. Why not? What's his explanation? What's his justification? And now that he sees her, or he doesn't see her, now that she sees him, he's got his back turned to her. She's made a piece of her own, where she's been. And he's taking her back to where they came from, and he's not even looking at her. What the hell's going on? So that's another psychology of what might have gone on in that story. And this is a poem based on that. Orpheus Reconsidered. It had been some time, as you'll remember, since he'd seen her. And time which for the living flashes, for the dead drags. Down there among the joyless shades, he took no food, but she, being educated in an epic hunger and knowledge of the bone, had long since grown quite ravenous. Her sweet eyes savage flames, and her heart a cauldron of scoured emptiness, in which his richest, wildest lyrics rang too thin, too tame. So when he'd struck the bargain, we all know, and turned to start the long climb back, still piping his tune, before they'd gone halfway, she filled with scorn, since he would not regard her there behind him, seething with resentments no simple lyric could appease. If she could not love, her cheeks of ash, her lips of carrion, her heart half wed now to an elder darkness. She would not belong to a boy who kept his word to demons rather than to his own heart. She turned before he turned to find her gone, and she fed on the promises death kept. I used to do a lot of hitchhiking, and occasionally, whatever you do, you run across people, of course, and sometimes it's quite interesting, sometimes a little scary, sometimes not. But if you're a writer, of course, you call it gathering material. At the time, you call it, oh my God. And in this case, I had stopped outside of a small town in California, lost my ride, or it dropped me off. It was a long way, late night. Bars had been out for a while. I was at an all-night cafe with everybody who was sobering up. The only seat left open was by a Native American gentleman. I sat there, had a backpack and so on. He started talking to me. We talked for a long time. We talked until he kicked us out. We sat outside for a while by the road and we talked and so on. And when he left, and I was waiting for my ride, I jotted down one part of what we had talked about, really what he had told to me, on a matchbook. I mean, literally, all this was on a matchbook. Skinny poem, but it's, page and a half. And what I was trying to catch was the sense, not everything he said, but the sense of a certain part of it. It had all been going along just fine, and you've been, I think, some of you are too young to have been in very many bar conversations, but sometimes you're in a conversation with somebody and all of a sudden it just takes a turn you didn't see coming at all, and you realize, oh my God, I could be dead if this had happened outside in the alley, when it took this little turn. And I thought everything was okay, or just some other turn. And that's what happened in this. I tried to catch a little sense of it. Do you know the country around here? Name of the poem. My people are like deer more than people. My mother's aunt told me this just after I was born, the first time. She told me she was 13, and do you know the country around here? Her mother was at Sacramento, called that now, when the white man came there 100 years ago or more and chased them, killing all the men and raping women they could catch, the old and sick and young. The men died once, the women every time. The women lived. She was 13 then, and she hid under the leaves. And they came to Boonville, they call it Boonville now, and got away. And she didn't have to hide in the leaves anymore then. Our people are different. My people are like the deer, nomads. They don't settle like your people. It was inevitable. Your people were smarter. Don't you think it was inevitable? I can see it in your eyes, the way you are looking at me now. No, it's true. Your eyes show me. My people are like the deer. At the beginning of this century, last century, 20th century, was the first of the major atrocities, the first of the major pogroms. The filthy term, the obscene term used for them is ethnic cleansing. It's obscene because when you use that term, you're taking the language and the values of the aggressor, of those committing the murders. There's nothing neutral about that term. There's nothing neutral about that activity. You see it in the newspapers all the time. Every time I see it, it infuriates me. There's nothing about ethnic cleansing that is cleansing. Armenians, Turks. Under the umbrella of blood. In the shower not 10 minutes ago and blind from the vinegar rinse, I was thinking, alive, I'm alive. When the stinging reminded me how Turks used to bet on just how far a headless man could run. It was orderly in its way, with a band of selected prisoners, troops in attendance, distance markers, a hammered copper plate fiery red as the sun at the end of a pole. As the prisoners one at a time ran past, the sword took off their heads, and the plate scorched the neck stumps shut to keep blood pressure up. So the runner ran farther, each stumbling on under the umbrella of blood until the disfigured collapse, all legs and loose elbows. Do you suppose as each head fell, staring and revolving, that it could hear the tossed coins clink on the outspread blanket? Could it see the body running off without it? As it lay speechless, facing dirt or the sky, as chance would have it, would it know whether it won or lost for its learned critics? I wonder, and I rush off to the typewriter, wiping my eyes clear, knowing if I am to get it right, the images under the final downpour must be running faster than the applauding coins of the world can ever fall. Okay, close to the end here. We live, my wife and I, and Pam's going to be reading tomorrow at noon. In the West, we've lived there most of our happy lives, our adult lives, the life you live by choice, somewhat anyway. Sometimes the choices can kind of catch you and spread you out a bit. We lived for 10 years in Tucson while I was commuting to New York, where I taught. Didn't want to leave the West. That was where the job was, however, in New York. And a phrase that's often used in Native American stories, oral stories, is, "Old Man Coyote was walking along." That's how you start. It's like once upon a time. And as soon as you hear that, you sit back and relax. This is my last poem. It's called With the Tip of the Hat to Old Man Coyote. A poet was walking along and came upon a blind woman whose beauty set him ablaze. As he stood beside her, she weeping in darkness. So he sang in praise of flames, and soon she could see why. A poet was walking along and came to the edge of a sea, but the sea was lifeless, so he spoke fishes and whales, sang seabirds and seals, whispered plankton and kelp, and then his tongue grew dry as sand, so he raised his head, slaking his thirst on song. A poet was walking along, and he came to weeping prisons, built of one-way glass, but claiming to be steel. So he wrote a stone, he did, and hurled it through the walls. A poet was walking along, and came upon lovers, quarreling, frightened, and sad. So he wrote a song about lovers, quarreling, frightened, and sad, who truly loved one another, and sang it, and they did. A poet was walking along, and came upon teachers teaching, it must be this, and it must be that. It may walk, but mustn't fly, and it may talk, but mustn't sing, and it may wish, but mustn't do. So he flew and sang and kept on doing what he had to do, bringing what is oldest in us home to what is new. A poet was walking along, and came upon distant places that made him think of home. And so he wrote of home for the strangers there. And when he had returned home, wrote of the distant places too, until they were the same. They were the same. Thank you very much.